Welcome, everyone. My name is Ken Craybill. I'm delighted to be here with you today from sunny Seattle. And I'm thinking that you're coming from probably all over the U.S. and maybe beyond. So much appreciate your joining today, taking an hour to think about self-care in overwhelming times. A few things to just set the lay of the land. One is, if you came to this webcast thinking you were going to hear from a self-care expert, you might want to go to a different webcast. I do practice self-care in my own fumbling way, and I do teach about self-care, but as my wife would attest, I'm not always the greatest at doing so. But that said, I have done a lot of curating of other sources about self-care, about teen care, about just how do we continue to keep on doing the work that we're doing, particularly in these times, which is just another whole huge overlay of trauma, if you will, on top of the work that many of you already do. So another thing I'll just note that this is an opportunity for me, of course, to present the material, but it's also an opportunity for each of you to chime in with your own thoughts and ideas and questions to one another. The chat box is for you to use liberally throughout. I will possibly not be able to track everything that's going on in the chat box, but I will try to do some of that. I do have assistance coming from Marcia Kubishko and Rachel Ely, who are in the background doing the tech, as well as will be tracking the chat box. So thank you, Rachel and Marcia, for being here. At the end of this hour, it's possible that some of you may want to stay on and just keep on talking, and so I'll actually go offline, but we will keep the platform up in case you want to continue interacting with each other. So know that that might be a possibility. The other thing I'll just say as a starting point is this is not intended for me to come and tell you how to take care of yourself. It's certainly not a lecture on self-care. What it really is an opportunity for, I think, all of us to really step back a bit, look at our lives, look at what we're already doing to take care of ourselves, which is very ample. We already do a lot of good self-care, but it's also an opportunity, I think, to kind of take a look and see if there might be something to tweak or let go of or do more of or something like that. So really what, just as an overview, as advertised, I'm going to state what is obviously obvious. These are hard and overwhelming times. We're all experiencing different levels of anxiety and grief and all of these things. And of course, they're part of ordinary life, but they seem to be amplified during these times. So we're going to take a look at some questions that will guide our time together. How do we name what's going on? How do we frame that? How do we make sense of it? What are some practices that we can be doing? And also, how do we just keep gentleness and compassion alive as we continue the work that we do? This is a quote from a book by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky called The Age of Overwhelm, which interestingly she wrote prior to the pandemic, but it's obviously even more in some ways relevant now. But she was interviewing Archbishop Desmond Tutu and said, you know, what do you do in times of despair? And his very profound and simple answer was, you show your humanity. So I hope in the long run that's what we can all do, is show our humanity in however that comes out. And sometimes humanity is not always pretty, but hopefully we can bring out the best of ourselves most of the time. A few things that I think need to be said. And I just am very aware personally, and I imagine you are too, that it's likely that most of us on this call do have some privilege that others don't have in the world. We probably have a roof over our head, a bed to sleep in, the ability to keep at some physical distance from others. We probably have ample food. We have running water, all of these things that I think often we take for granted, that many, many people in this day and time are not able to have access to. And so I think without diminishing the experience that we're all having and the hardships it's imposing, I think it's also fair to say that we come at this from a place of privilege. And I want to just use that as a way of contextualizing where we are. This is a quote from The Guardian that I read recently, and the article said, "Save us the platitudes of coronavirus as the great leveler. Abandon this sickly myth that we are all in this together. For some, and for many of us, this is a time of grand inconvenience, of undoubted stress, and a self-evident loss of freedom. However, for others, this is a national and personal disaster, a present defined by turmoil and future snatched away. Coronavirus is not some great leveler. It is exacerbating inequality right now." Another way to talk about this is that we're living in a time of apocalypse. However, not necessarily in the way that we generally think about apocalypse or the way it's portrayed in artistic renderings. But really, this is a time of unveiling, of uncovering, which is actually the literal meaning from the Greek of apocalypse, the revelation, the unveiling of how things are. And the reason I bring this in is because I think at the very center of self-care in this time is to have our eyes wide open and be able to see how things are. And there are lots of good things we can be aware of, but there are also these very troubling things that are happening where we're seeing that this crisis is revealing healthcare inequalities, class divisions, race divisions, and that workers who are among the least paid are, at this point, some of the very most essential for not only our well-being, but our survival. So we're seeing fault lines in that. And we can hope, of course, that it will reveal something that can be changed. But what we see, just to be a little more specific, is a recession that's throwing 50 million Americans out of work, perhaps more. And it does shine a spotlight on as in this opinion, which I actually agree with, the perversity of our nation's employer-based healthcare system. The deepening economic crisis also exposes the political foundations of the economy, that it's really not driven by data, it's driven by whim more than anything. And that the coronavirus crisis provides a vivid reminder that we are actually capable of helping to shelter, protect, provide means for people in times of crisis like this. And we need to wonder if this might give way to thinking about doing so in non-critical times, or at least less critical times. So these are all things that are being uncovered that I think it's all part of setting the stage for our talking about self-care. And again, I invite you in the chat box to provide commentary, questions, whatever you wish. So to look at you and your situation, I've been thinking about signs that you may be ambivalent or have mixed feelings about being here today. I'll just confess that I'm not real fond of self-care workshops or seminars. I've been to too many, I think, that it felt like I was just being guilt-tripped somehow for not doing enough or something like that. But I don't know what your situation is, but here are some signs that maybe you might be ambivalent, and perhaps there are more. You might be basically saying, I'm too tired and stretched thin right now to even think about self-care. And my guess, especially if you are not working from home in particular, but working in a setting, or even working from home, you might just feel too stretched. So kudos for taking time out to come on board. Some of you might be saying, I don't do bubble baths. That's not my thing. This is really, I suppose, just getting at the fact that some of us think of self-care as self-pampering. And while that can be an important part of self-care, it is so much more than that. And so hopefully this is an opportunity to reframe that a bit. And then I imagine many of us are saying, honestly, I just need a good cry. More than any webinar, I just need an outlet to be able to put it out there, somebody to give me a good listening to, somebody to just allow me to break down a little bit. And absolutely, that is true. And there might be some other things we can do too. Don't even think of suggesting I switch to non-dairy ice cream is my personal way of saying don't take things away from me that I value or that make me happy or comfortable, even if they're not great for me. I think that this is not the time to strip away everything that gives us pleasure, although there is an evaluation that can take place. And another is this idea that self-care is hard. And it's not easy. It's not something that we talk about a lot, how hard it is. But for those of you who say to yourselves, nobody ever talks about that, I'm going to talk about it. So here's something I am borrowing from an article I read on what nobody tells you about self-care, and here's a brief excerpt of it. I tried to find an image of my best stereotypical social worker. I hope that person is none of you. I don't know if she is. What social workers and other people don't often tell you is that self-care can be completely terrible. Self-care includes a lot of adulting and activities you want to put off indefinitely. I can attest to that. Self-care sometimes means making tough decisions which you fear others will judge. And self-care involves asking for help. We can't care for ourselves by ourselves. It often involves being vulnerable. It involves asking painfully honest questions of ourselves and allowing others to ask them of us, loved ones. So that the idea around self-care is that we need a circle of support to truly care for ourselves. It's not an independently won achievement of doing self-care. So we're going to take a look at some self-care practices, and I'm kind of focusing them around the ideas of awareness and balance and connection. And I will say this might feel a bit like a potpourri or a stew of things. They do connect, but they might not all logically flow, but bear with me if you would. I think the first thing to think about is this notion of slowing down and quieting our busy lives. I would guess that most of us have at some level felt a quieting or a slowing down of the pace of our lives and a simplifying because we're not going out to restaurants and bars. We're not able to get together with friends. We're not going dancing. There's so many things that we're not able to do at this point. And so it's kind of allowing us to narrow things down. And I think there's some real value in that because it can help us assess what is important and what's not so important. And mindfulness, of course, which is defined in many ways, but it's really a way of taking into account what is. And I like this particular definition by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's done a lot of research around mindfulness. And he says it's the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. Just taking it in and noticing and being aware. There's something, as many of you know very well, something very powerful about that. Whether you know that as doing regular meditation practice or whether you just simply know it as being a keen observer of what's out there in the world. This is a meme that some of you have probably seen. Is your mind full or are you being mindful? Another way of putting this, Ram Dass, who died this past December, wrote a book called Be Here Now. And I think that's a wonderful, simple rendition of what mindfulness is about. So I'd like to invite you to a brief activity, and this is an opportunity just to create a sense of awareness around our own bodies and what's going on in them. I'm going to read some instructions to you. This is actually adapted from Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Skills Training by Marsha Linehan. I've reduced it to about a minute and a half. And so I'll just speak these instructions, leaving about 5 seconds in between each one, and just ask you to find a comfortable position and allow yourself to kind of take in what it is I say and be mindful of it. So find a comfortable position, and staying in this position, I invite you to listen for your response after each of these statements. Here's the first one. Feel your hair touching your head. And I'm not suggesting feel with your hands. I'm just saying feel your hair touching your head. Feel your belly rising and falling as you breathe. Feel the space between your eyes. Feel the distance between your ears. Feel your breath touching the back of your eyes while you inhale. Notice your arms touching your body. Feel the bottoms of your feet. Imagine a beautiful day at the beach. Notice the position of your tongue in your mouth. Feel how one arm is more relaxed than the other. Notice any tightness in your left thigh. Imagine what it would feel like to float on a cloud. Imagine what it would feel like to be stuck in molasses. Imagine floating in warm water. Feel your face getting soft. Imagine a beautiful flower. As we close, I invite you to simply notice your breathing, how your body does what it needs to do. And then I'll invite you to come back into the room. Thank you for doing that. It's an interesting exercise from my point of view because it juxtaposes some things that aren't kind of logical and causes me to think a little differently. And I think sometimes illogic is what we need to tap into when we do self-care to allow ourselves to go beyond our usual kind of linear thinking. So thank you. Mindfulness is not so much what you choose to focus on, but the quality of the awareness that you bring to each moment. And so one can be mindful about virtually anything and notice it. Mindfulness also shows us what is happening in our bodies, our emotions, our minds, and the world. And through mindfulness, we avoid harming ourselves and each other. I particularly like this quote by Thich Nhat Hanh because it really does speak to the fact that this is a way that we can nurture living peacefully and compassionately with ourselves and with the larger world. And I think that's absolutely critical at all times, and especially in these times. All right. So shifting gears a little bit, I'd like to take a few moments and just talk about what we're experiencing. We've already done a little bit of that. But let me just say, yes, we are experiencing trauma. This is trauma. It's overwhelming. It's got overwhelming demands placed on us. Another definition, again, there's the overwhelm of the ordinary systems of care that give us a sense of control, connection, and meaning. So it's also the case that many people, some of us on this call, have had significant histories of trauma, early childhood histories of trauma perhaps. And so we all already know and feel and experience the impact of trauma. And then here comes the pandemic, and it really just creates another layer of trauma. And I think it's worth calling it that because it truly is. And we all respond to it in different ways. But the truth of the matter is that your brain and my brain are not operating properly. And that actually makes you and I perfectly normal in these abnormal times. I'll illustrate in a moment what I'm talking about, but here's a little meme that I find interesting. We spend our life sleeping and working and eating, and then the rest of the time, a full 1/3 of the time, looking for things that we had just a minute ago. I don't know your experience, but I can relate to that quite nicely. And again, Laura Vanderlipsky says, no matter the cause, the sensation of overwhelm and the impact of it has on your ability to focus and make your way through the world can be absolutely disorienting, even debilitating. So I'll just share a few things that I heard about happened to a guy who happens to be married to my wife. But that guy recently put a kettle of water on the back burner, turned the dial to high on the front burner, and then came back a minute later and was befuddled why the water was still cold, and he was feeling intense heat in his face. Same guy recently walked into a room, had no clue why, even though it was crystal clear to him 3 seconds earlier. And then the same guy is consistently having trouble with word finding in conversations. Lots of long pauses, lots of, and I don't know about you, but again, that's become a very common experience for me. It's just sort of like I can't access the things that have come readily to me in the past. So you are welcome to share some of your own incidences of being forgetful or absent-minded or searching for words or anything else. But you don't need to out yourself. It's okay. Another frame to put on this and naming it is taken from an article that came out of the Harvard Business Review, and it was entitled "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." And I found this to be a really helpful way of thinking about things in this day and time. Just a few excerpts here. This is an interview actually with David Kessler, who is somebody who has done a lot of research in grief and in grieving, has written alongside of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who has written some seminal work on death and dying. And what he says is, yes, we're feeling grief at a number of different levels. And you can read this for yourselves, but the highlights are basically that, you know, even though we know this is temporary, it certainly doesn't feel that way, because we also don't know exactly when it's going to end or come to change, and whether it's going to be all that different when it's all over. We don't know. We know things will be different, just as they were after 9/11, but we don't know exactly what that is. So that's one level of grieving. It's a loss of normalcy. It's a loss of connection. It's a loss of lots of things that we're experiencing. And it's not only individual, but it's collectively. And then the question was posed, how can individuals, or what can they do to manage all this grief? And he goes on to say that one way to think about this is to understand the stages of grief, and makes a point that these are not necessarily linear, and in fact, these stages are somehow convenient fictions, actually, that we create for the purpose of communicating and studying. But that said, I think it's fascinating that he gives examples. You know, often there's denial, and early on we say this virus isn't going to affect us. It's way over there. Or there's then anger. You're making me stay home and taking away my activities. How can you do this to me? And then there's bargaining. Okay, if I do the physical distancing thing for 2 weeks, will everything be better? or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And then there's sadness. I don't know when this is going to end, and I'm just feeling kind of bereft of knowing and how to even hope. And then acceptance is this is happening. I have got to figure out how to proceed. And he goes on to say that acceptance is where the power lies. And I think it's fair to say that we all probably go back and forth among all of these, maybe at the same time. I think many of us, myself included, are still in denial at some level. There's anger some days, there's bargaining, sadness, acceptance. But I think this is a helpful frame to put on what's happening to us. And so I offer that to you. But it's not all bad news. It's also very, very good news. No, maybe not that. But it's also a time when I think we're discovering some gifts that are coming out of this hard time. One of those is reconnecting in new and deeper ways, often with other people. But as this quote says, if that's not possible for you, there are lots of other ways to connect, through journaling, painting, making a graphic novel with a dark storyline, talk to the trees, whatever. But it is truly a way that I think we are learning to recognize and value the connections we have with nature, with people, with so many things, and also to kind of deepen those ties. So that's good news. I think another good news is it's a time of coming alive for some of us, amidst some of the deadening that happens as well. But I would pose to you the question, in what ways are you feeling more deeply alive in these times? And I'd invite you to chat as you wish in the box about some things that you've noticed for yourself coming more alive. I think our senses are heightened during this time. I'm certainly personally being brought more alive by just springtime and the beauty I see, but there's so much more. So as you might type in those things, I'm going to suggest that we look at what is self-care. And I like to think of it as the sum total of hundreds of thousands of small actions. There is no one package that is a self-care package that obviously fits all. And it's not even the big stuff we do. I think it's mostly the little things that we do that we don't even recognize are part of our self-care. But I think it's another way to put that is it's an intentional way of living by which our values, our attitudes, our actions become integrated into our day-to-day routines. And so it's a way of being. And it's certainly not intended to be something that is separate from our lives and that we sort of roll out when there's a crisis or an emergency, say, okay, emergency response plan. It really is something that we want to incorporate into everything we do. And I trust that all of you have obviously been doing that, but it does call for us to maybe reevaluate and call on new resources during these harder times. Another quote, when you are in alignment with who you really are, you cannot help but uplift those with whom you come in contact. So another thing that self-care is, it's a gift to other people around you. It's something that you offer to others because when you are around people, and we all know this, when you're around somebody who is grounded, centered, relatively calm, there's just something powerful about that gets transmitted oftentimes. You know, there's a saying about trauma that is not transformed is transmitted. But you could also say that trauma that is transformed is also transmitted. And I think that's the case here. And then a reminder about self-care. You already have within you everything you need. And I say here the what, the how, and the who. And let me explain what I'm talking about here. If you were to ask yourself at this point in time, and maybe you said something like, if I were to eat more healthfully, or if I were to exercise more regularly, or meditate more frequently, or get more sleep, or let go of toxic relationships, why might I do that? And just ask ourselves, what would be the reasons for doing that? Or also, what would be the benefits of doing that? And when we do that self-examination, we will come up with the answers within. We can also ask ourselves the question of, what is it that I might do that would allow me to be successful in exercising more, in eating more healthfully, in letting go of those toxic relationships? And again, those answers almost always are held within. And then a third question we might ask ourselves is the who. And this brings us back to self-care as being often a relational experience. Who can support me? Who can help me? Who can be my buddy in accomplishing or working on these things? So it's not to say that we can't pick up things from outside and learn things from other people, but when it comes to the motivation around self-care, you've already got it. It's just a matter of sort of identifying it and bringing it out. If some of you notice this links at all with motivational interviewing, then you can see right through me. So, what self-care is not? Well, it's not about being selfish, even though I think many of us sometimes tend to think that way. I share with you a quote here that comes from Audre Lorde, and she states very strongly about it not being selfish, and goes on to say that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. It's actually about self-preservation, and that it's an act of political warfare. Now, that's a striking quote, and I think that if we know who Audre Lorde is, it helps us understand. This is a black woman who is an activist, who is lesbian, who is among all of those sort of checks all those boxes for people who our society has marginalized and looked down upon and oppressed. And so there's a whole literature around this, as many of you may know, around self-care as being a political act, as being something that is something just beyond doing for the sake of doing something to feel good. And so, again, without being able to get into it in great depth, I encourage you to potentially look up Audre Lorde and just get a sense of that. It's also not about doing more. It's tempting to feel like, oh, self-care, I just got to add one more thing to that already lengthy to-do list. But I'm always reminded by a quote from Thomas Merton, who says that the rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. And for me, that rush and pressure is kind of akin to the doing more, speeding up, trying to get everything checked off the list. And Thomas Merton goes on to say that this violence, when we get caught up in busyness, which is the antithetical to mindfulness, that it becomes a form of this innate violence because it robs us of that root wisdom that needs to continually feed our work and our actions. And so I know that none of you probably are wanting to be engaged in violence, and that's a strong word, but violation is also a word from the same roots, which means to violate who we want to be in the world, to violate the way we want to be. And so, again, let's think more about self-care as letting go of and reconfiguring our lives rather than doing more. So what does go on this list, one might ask? And here's one of those lists that you can find on the internet, but I like this one. It's got 7 basic tips, and again, I'm not going to be able to go into it in great detail, but prioritizing, I think, during times like this is absolutely critical. Organizing our lives and creating rituals even in our lives can be very, very helpful to bring some sense of control to the chaos. Breathing is good. It's a good thing. Practicing meditation. I know that in my household that we've started doing this more intentionally during these times, and just 10 minutes at a time perhaps, whatever your own practice might be. And definitely being easier on ourselves and getting lots of rest and recovery time, being good to ourselves in that way. And remembering that the real you in the midst of all this is still the real you. We might change in a lot of different ways, but that who you are in the world doesn't need to, that can stay solid. Detach in a healthy way and embrace uncertainty. I don't know how else to live because there's so much uncertainty in the world. So being able to live in a world where we recognize that we don't have control is very liberating. And then trust that this will pass too. Maybe something else will take its place, but this will pass. And speaking of passing, we had to break this into 2 sets of slides in order to upload properly. So Marcia, I'm trusting that you can go ahead and, oh, that was well played. Speaking of passing, this is a quote from a friend and former colleague. She said, "This too shall pass, maybe like a kidney stone, but it will pass." I like that. So just a word more about prioritizing. I don't know if any of you have seen this meme, but rather than you having to look at it too carefully, I'll just basically interpret it for you in a brief paragraph. Basically, what it's saying is right now of high importance for most people is coffee in the internet. There's been a huge increase in importance of sweatpants, and there's been a huge drop in importance of cars, bras, and shaving. So this is a whimsical view on prioritizing things, but in seriousness, I think this is a great time to do that. And then we can also talk about becoming a self-care activist. Again, another way of thinking about self-care is not something that's fluffy and mushy, but it's something that truly is imperative for our lives. And again, without being able to go into great detail, manage your boundaries, say no to toxic relationships, question your self-talk, own your experience. Just a few things, and I'm reading this from Anna Rowley's article, but around boundaries. Don't confuse this with being selfish or narcissistic, she says. It means being very clear where you stop and other people start. Boundaries keep us safe, and how they do that differs based on our confidence and emotional well-being. And then in terms of toxic relationships, she says, relationships define and shape us. They help us grow, and they can stifle our potential. And so this is a good time to examine the impact that these certain relationships are having on us, I think. And question your self-talk. Self-talk can be our coach in a positive way, or it can be a massive critic. And I think most of us tend to naturally, biologically maybe, even go towards the massive critic part, but how about if we really come to see the strengths and focus on those things and see ourselves as capable and able. Again, not in a narcissistic way, but just in a real accurate view of ourselves. And then owning your own experience is that idea of consciously acknowledging and accepting what is and what is happening and what has happened. And it's the opposite of avoiding and diminishing or posing. And that is intended to mean being a poser is pretending to be somebody you're not. In the long run, never helpful. All right. I put this slide in because it's from the CDC, and I wanted to make sure we had an official CDC message here. I'm interested in the fact that they focus on 2 things. What is what you can control, and then limiting exposure to social media and news sources. I would say sort of editorially to that second one that it's hard to limit ourselves, but I think it's important to do so. But even more important is to be very judicious in what news sources we listen to and what we pay attention to, because as we all know, there's a lot that's out there that's misleading and misdirected. So getting into a few more tips here, I trust that you recognize this album cover, but what do you see here that might be problematic in the age of COVID-19 in terms of taking care of themselves? Anyone want to put something in the chat box about what might be some concerns you have about these four fine fellows walking across the streets? So yes, they're not 6 feet apart, no face masks, no gloves. And I don't think going barefoot is a great idea during this time either. So the message is don't do that, right? Now, maybe you want to do this though. I think there's a little manipulation in the photograph there, but I totally get a chuckle out of this meme. So we do want to create that distance. We want to do the things that we know will protect not only ourselves, but everyone around us. And then we also want to get back to basics. And here's something that I actually keep on my laptop on the page in front of me. And it's really the basics. And if we just did these things, I think it would go a long way. And we all know these things, but it's interesting how we forget and need to be reminded. But eating well, however you define that, moving daily, hydrating often, sleeping lots, loving yourself, and then just continuing to do all of that. Another way of thinking about self-care and how we can approach this is by doing what is a new term to me, doing a compassionate body scan. And I don't know that you can see the fine print in this meme, but we all know that stress that we experience, and some of that stress is necessary. It's called good stress, but then there's sort of distress that we experience. But when we're constantly under this heavier stress, our bodies are keeping the score, as Bessel van der Kolk says, and they are reacting. And so you may well notice what's happening in your own body, whether that's an increased heart rate, whether it's having sort of gastrointestinal problems or headaches, and they may or may not be related to COVID, hopefully not. But these are just things that we do experience. And so it's worth paying attention to our bodies and doing a compassionate body scan, which simply means to do it in a loving way and just by noticing. And I know many of you on the call are much better equipped than I to speak to this in a more health-oriented medical way. But our bodies are indeed keeping the score at this point in time, and it's worth paying attention to. And then there's affectionate breathing. Again, I like the addition of the word affectionate. And once again, I'm just going to do a very brief exercise. And this is a breathing exercise, and invite you to participate in it if you would. It's something that, again, I encourage you to take a comfortable position, perhaps put your feet flat on the floor, and invite you to just try this. Let your eyes, if you wish, gently close or remain partially or fully open. And then taking a few slow, easy breaths and releasing any unnecessary tension in your body. And then if you like, you might place a hand over your heart or another soothing place as a reminder that we're bringing not only awareness, but affectionate awareness to our breathing and to ourselves. And you can leave your hand there or let it rest at any time. And now beginning to notice your breathing in your body, feeling your body breathe in and feeling your body breathe out. Just letting your body breathe you. There's nothing you need to do. And I'll just pause here for a half minute. And then to continue doing so, and I'll just add a few more ways of noticing, perhaps noticing how your body is nourished on the in-breath and how it relaxes on the out-breath. Notice how the rhythm of your breathing, the flowing in and out, is a natural rhythm of your body. And feeling your whole body subtly moving with the breath, kind of like the movement of the sea. So I realize this is a hurried up version of a practice on a webinar, but again, there are many, many different practices around breath. Who knew there were so many different ways to breathe? Nobody told me that growing up. But it's a really kind of fun and fascinating thing to play with, breath, and notice the impact it has on our bodies, minds, spirits, everything. All right, so again, something that came across my desk a while back, these are some questions we might ask ourselves. So there's bodily exercises, there's attitudes, but there's also kind of introspective questions that I think are worth asking. And here's some daily questions that you might find. You can choose one. You might even ask it when you get on the phone with somebody or when you have dinner if you live with people. What are you grateful for today? And just allow that to be the focus of attention. Or who are you and others checking in on and connecting with? I've certainly found that I have a much greater impulse to at least check in with people, which goes against my introvertish self, but I found I need that. I need that connection. And here's an interesting one. What expectations of normal am I letting go of today? I'm a fan of Bruce Cockburn, who's a Canadian singer-songwriter, and he wrote a song one time, and he said the lyric goes, "The trouble with normal is it always gets worse." So I don't know what normal is, but I do know that allowing ourselves to let go of is one of the best forms of self-care that we can do, as is getting outside, moving our bodies, and also just both noticing and creating beauty wherever you can find it. And there's much to be seen there. Some additional questions that you might ask, and again, this is totally up to you, but I think that as we are slowed down, these are interesting things for us to ponder. What does this moment to mean to you? How is anxiety manifesting? What is in this new reality, what are you grateful for? And so on and so forth. You can read these for yourself. I would encourage you to try on the last one. What are you proud of in your response to this difficult time? And again, I invite you to type in the chat box if you wish. What are some things you're proud of in your response to this difficult time? It can be something very small or large, but I think it's, again, another way to focus our attention and allow ourselves to be strengths-based with ourselves, I think. All right, this is hard to see, but it says quiz. So I have a question for you. What is the only sea on Earth with no coastline? And type fast if you know the answer. And I'll allow for just a few seconds here, but anybody know what the only sea on Earth is with no coastline? And I'm not going to give you enough time to Google it, although some of you are very, very fast. But here's the answer. It's the Sargasso Sea. Who knew? It is the only sea on Earth that is actually formed by ocean currents and has no coastline whatsoever. Now, it also is home to a particular kind of, I don't know if seaweed is the right term, but a plant that does not have its roots in the ocean floor. It has its own roots in the water. And that's called sargassum. And then sadly, this is also an area where it has become an area of much plastic pollution because these currents just sweep up and take in and gather together much of the garbage of the sea thanks to humans. Another quiz question. What European country shares a border with Brazil? Anybody know? Not seeing any typing. It turns out that it is French Guiana. French Guiana, it turns out, is owned, if you will, and run by France. It has the euro as its currency. And so what appeared to be a trick question actually has an accurate answer. And you were, darn, thinking Argentina. Yeah, good try. What is the easternmost state in the United States? And I will share with you that this is not maybe as simple as it appears. Anybody want to make a guess about this one? This is a good trivia question. So Florida is a great guess. Easternmost state in the U.S. Maine is a very good guess. Rhode Island. Oh. All right. So we're trying to hit the eastern seaboard there. So may I say, and please don't throw anything at me, but the answer is Alaska. Now, if you look at this map, and if you believe that the international date line is at least one way of thinking about where the eastern hemisphere and the western hemisphere start and end, it turns out that Alaska is actually not only the easternmost, but it's also the westernmost and the northernmost state in the 50 states. If you buy into my theory about, well, not just mine, but of the international date line, because the strait or the islands there in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, continue to stretch across the international date line. So why do I even bring these things into this? Well, one is that this is all part of the balancing act of our times. We have to just get away from it all, and we have to look at other things, whether that's watching old TV reruns or putting out trivia questions like this. And so that's the reason, and you're welcome to use these, of course, with friends. But it's all about balance. It's about finding a time to certainly be caught up and concerned and feeling the pain of the moment, but it's also a time for allowing ourselves to get away, to just escape and do something different. And so I'll just say a few words. Glennon Doyle is somebody that some of you may know. She's a person who has written publicly a lot about her own recovery from a variety of addictive behaviors. And what I like about this quote is she takes two words and she balances them and makes one word. And she says, life is brutal and it's also beautiful. And so she's coined this term, it's brutiful. I don't know that I'll ever use that in a sentence, but I love the concept of the fact that this is a both and experience that we're experiencing. It's both amazing and painful and beautiful and terrible and tragic and life-giving, all of these things. And so part of self-care, I think, is just being able to take in that balance of a both and way of thinking. It's also a time to make music, get that guitar or whatever instrument you have out of the case and to play it, to play the piano maybe. If you don't know how to play anything, you don't have to. You can play the triangle or drums. There's always this, of course. Sorry if I've offended anybody who plays the bagpipes there. But we can also listen to music. And I don't know, again, many people are inspired by music in all of their lives, but this is a time, I think, when we can be truly revisiting the inspiration that music brings. And of course, listed here are 5 people who we've actually lost recently due to COVID-19 related symptoms. All of them amazing musicians. I will say that John Prine is probably my most favorite singer-songwriter of all time, and I'm still heavy of heart in his loss. But I am going to get my guitar out and try to play some of his songs again. And then we can practice wonder. And wherever you live, and maybe it's not outside your door, maybe it's on the internet, but nature has not paid attention to COVID. Nature has continued to do what it does. And at this time of year, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, there's so much beauty to behold. And so I encourage that, certainly. There's games we can play. Some people are even playing Pandemic. I don't recommend it, but that said, maybe I've never played it, so I don't know. But then some of you might just want to do something totally different and go to an old music. Although when I thought about The Sound of Music, I thought of it as kind of light. But then I realized that there are people being chased by Nazis in The Sound of Music, so maybe not a great example after all. But as we draw to a close here, I just want to focus in on it and connection. And this is actually a mural in Seattle in my backyard, and this is at the fish ladders rather, and shows the connection between the wildlife and people's living styles and water and mountains and all of these things. And again, just to remember, we are all connected in so many ways. This is a form of connection, of course, that we are tragically seeing, maybe not tragically, but we unfortunately have had to witness in oh so many ways, and you too have been engaged in this kind of connecting. And so even though it's not as if we can be in the same room or provide the usual hugs and touch that we often want to with our loved ones, there is still possibility for connection. And I'm going to close almost with just introducing a few resources that I find valuable. This is one by Laura Vanderlip-Lipsky. Many of you know her previous book that she wrote called Trauma Stewardship. This is a newer one, again, written before the pandemic, but very applicable. And she talks, as you can see, about these 5 kind of distinct ways of how we might approach our lives in the age of overwhelm. Laura's books always have lots of New Yorker cartoons, so I stole this one. You can see the guy wearing the cone on his head saying, "It keeps me from looking at my phone every 2 seconds to be distracted." There are many, many resources out there. These are just a few. A Paradise Built in Hell is actually an interesting book written by Rebecca Solnit. Some of you may have read it, but it specifically speaks to how we, in terms of traumatic times, how we cope as human beings. And so something I would recommend to you. And I didn't want to do a webinar without showing you at least a sample self-care plan. And so this is Ignacio's self-care plan. Go Ignacio. I'm not suggesting you have to write it down, but it might be worth doing. Just like if you go to the grocery store and get groceries, you might categorize what you're going to buy in what section. It might be worth making a self-care plan and getting a sense of balance by knowing what you want to do, intend to do around your mind, your body, your soul, your spirit, and what you want to accomplish. And I'm going to close with this. I'll read this to you. This is something that I found very moving, and I often close workshops that I provide with this, so I'll share it with you. May you be blessed with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships so that you will live deep in your heart. And may you be blessed with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people and the earth so that you will work for justice, equity, and peace. And may you be blessed with tears to shed for those who suffer so that you will reach out your hand to comfort them and change their pain into joy. And may you be blessed with the foolishness to think that you can make a difference in the world, even in these times, so that you will do the things which others say cannot be done. And I'll leave you with these quotes and just say thank you so much for attending. Again, if anybody wants to stay on, we can hold it open, and you're welcome to communicate with each other as you wish in the chat box, or you're welcome to step away. So take good care.